Hi, welcome to this sort of tutorial on color grading in Adobe Lightroom. This is a new feature in Lightroom 22, I guess 21, in the newest version that came out. They did a big thing at Adobe Max this past October about it. I personally myself am still trying to get used to it, just playing around, trying to figure out how to best use it for my workflow. So I have some sample raw images that I downloaded off the internet, and then I have some other images that are going to help me explain how color grading works. So I'm just going to make this screen a little bigger. And this is with the newest version of Lightroom. I'm using Lightroom Classic. This should also work in Lightroom CC, or if you're using Adobe Camera Raw through Photoshop. So where we had the split toning panel, it is now color grading. So if you're looking for split toning, it's no longer there. We actually have more functions that we can use now. So I have this Ansel Adams piece with the zone system that he helped create, and we're going to talk about how we can use different parts of color grading. Typically you would do this towards the end of your workflow. You want to kind of, work on making sure everything's straightened with the transform. If you have any lens corrections, and through the basic tab, HSL, etc. But we're going to jump straight into color grading. So we have the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So you can have this sort of three-way choice, global, and in-depth choices. So we're going to start off with the shadows. Now when we create our adjustments, it's only going to affect the shadows, which is why I have this black and white piece here. We have our shadows, midtones, and highlights. This is adding color to your work. So it's adding a hue. So you can click and drag. And if you notice, the highlights and midtones are not colored. The only thing we're affecting color on is the shadows. You can have something that's more saturated or less. You can hold down Shift and it'll just give you a straight line. You hold down Alt or Option. Command and Control, you kind of stick with the same sort of saturation level, but then you can choose from various hues. For the sake of this, I'm going to choose this blue and I'm going to take it all the way down here. You also have these sliders here. You can click and drag for the hue and click and drag for the saturation, just to have more control. Here you have your luminance. You can play with the sliders. You can see you have more bright, less bright, and it kind of defaults into the center. I will set this at 0. We have blending, so this is sort of how it blends. So if you pick it all the right, it kind of has a smooth blend. It will actually bleed a little over to your midtones, and if you do it the right, it's actually a very narrow band. As you can see exactly what is affecting in this sample. And the balance, so you can see it's sort of the balance of it. Next, we're going to go over to the midtones. And this is going to be like if you're doing portraits, this would be sort of like, your skin tones and stuff, your neutrals. This is where you're going to notice a lot of color, because when you're looking into that midpoint neutral, you know, we kind of look for that to be neutral. Rather, we're used to seeing the shadows and the highlights have the sort of colors. If you're familiar with teal and gray, this is kind of where that comes from. And we're going to choose something just kind of opposite. We're going to do this lime green. So you can see it's only adding color to the midtones where it's blending there. Again, we can adjust our luminance and, you know, see what effects that we are looking for. Do you want something more bright or not? And then our blending. So when you have two hues here, blending, it's sort of mixing them together. And over here, it's sort of, the colors are very distinct. And the balance between it all. And next we'll go to highlights. So we're looking at zone 8, 9, and 10, and a little bit of 7. So I'm just going to take this to this magenta. So you can see where we can adjust here, more or less blended, and the balance between it all. Now this gives you a very different effect because this happens to be a black and white image that we're adding hue to, tones, colors. Global edits is if we have this balance of the blue, neon green, and pink. And this is if we're adding a color to mix with all of that. So if I add red, it's just pulling red with all of it. Now, it's kind of hard to understand how this is going to affect your colors. So we have this panel here, and I can pull up what's, so our shadows are blue. I can toggle on and off here. You can see original and that effect. Next, we'll go to the midtones. See how it's affecting the colors in zone 5. And over here, we're looking at zones 6 and 7. Sort of adding that hue to those colors. And then again, if we look at globally. So let's see how this looks on an actual image. So I have here, we have kind of this kind of orangey green image here. Start off with, nope. And I'm just kind of leveling the image out to see what looks best. Leave it off. This is a good tool to go into the transform to straighten your image because a lot of people do not stand correct straight. We tend to put all of our weight in like sort of a contrapposto pose. We put our weight on one foot or another, or we tilt our camera. So it's always good to make sure your lines are correct here in post. All right, so I just did some lens correction here. And again, this isn't something I shot, so I'm not completely familiar with how this lens distorts. So this is something that is a little outside of my realm because I didn't shoot this image and it's not my equipment. So again, I'm going to start off with the basic here. I'm going to just pull those midtones up a little. And the coloring is going to be kind of hard. Again, we're kind of color correct, and then we can add our color grading separately. I'm looking at the walls as my neutral. That's close. All right, so I think that's as close my walls are going to get. It's just kind of hard to kind of get a sort of neutral look because we have this strong light coming off, and then we have this light coming in filtered through this green. So I'm trying to think how to make the walls look neutral without having sort of a strong color cast. I see kind of a cyan here, but I don't really see it elsewhere. So that might be something we can play around deeper later. Pull down my highlights. This is a raw image, so remember you have that wider range of value. Pull down my highlights because I don't want to blow out this. Again, we're having light that's coming in through the screen. And then my shadows, I'm going to lift up a little to kind of get a better sort of view of the image. I don't want it to be too dark and moody. I'm trying to have a different look to it. Again, we're going to try to see how colors can influence that. Bring up the highlights a little. Just touch them. I always like to just bump the clarity up a little. You can kind of get this nice hazy look. We can try to dehaze a bit. I think we do need a little haze. All right. Tone down that vibrance. And I can play around with my tone curve, HSL, but I'm just going to skip that for now because we're particularly looking at the new color grading function. All right, so I'm going to start off with my shadows. They're really green now, so maybe I might. So again, if I'm pulling it all over here, this adds a lot of color. So I think it's probably best to kind of stick to just a minimal. This is very tiny adjustment. I might pump up the luminance a bit. This is practical use, you know, I'm not trying to give a whole new tone to it or make it a completely different painted color. We're just color grading. We're tuning the colors. We're thinking about color in a sense for emotion and feeling. At least that's what I think about when I'm color grading. And again, this is a new tool. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. But yeah, so highlights. We kind of have this blue highlights. If I go opposite, and I'm choosing to go opposite because I want that contrast. That's why teal and orange works good. And I'm just looking at the eye, looking at effects. It's hard to do an exact science with color grading because a lot of it is kind of a dealer's choice of what you're doing now. My midtones. See, if I do this, it doesn't look right. Blue. Just a hair cyan. And this is like the most subtle effect. And I actually may not even add much at all. Now I'm going to go to, now since I have all my shadows, midtones, and highlights adjusted, I think I'm going to play around with the blending. right, so what I'm going to do is, let's see my before and after. So it was kind of a darker image, kind of got this moody tones to it. I still have that feeling, but I think I enhanced it, add some warmth and some color contrast. Again, I'm only using my color grading very subtly right now. You know, you could really kind of go very in depth to really kind of change it. But I'm just working subtly right now, so I'm trying to get used to it. I'm easing it a bit. And I'm just going to look at some sharpening. All right, so I think this is looking pretty good. Again, I can spend a lot more time and effort on this, but this is just sort of playing around with color grading. This is another image I was playing around with color grading. I'm not in love with how I graded it. This is how I graded it. It's very bright, actually more saturated than I typically would work on for a piece for myself. But the original image, we looked like we had some multiple light sources. We had a very cool light, and then we have natural daylight and some warm light coming in. So it was very hard to kind of get a good neutral going on. So I wanted to kind of put some warmth back into that skin and kind of have sort of a fun, poppier image. So I'm going to upload both this color zone and other zone systems so you can play around with the color grading on your own without feeling too scared. This actually helps you understand it a bit more with adding the colors into different zones before you sort of start playing around with your own images. I also will have a link for some random, this sort of set of free images to play around from the internet, so you don't have the pressure of using some of your own images. So I'll also link to some other new videos that I found for color grading. It's a brand new feature in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. I'm really excited to play around with it and see where it could improve my workflow.